welcome to this edition of Consciousness Raising Online. And for those who are here with this live, I apologize for being a little bit late, but I wanted to get this right because most of us are aware of the transitioning of two people that they keep calling civil rights icons. And if you've never heard me define it as civil disobedience, let me just briefly explain that the civil rights movement was the name that somebody else gave the movement. We called it, in reality, civil disobedience. And if you look at what actually occurred, that's what it was about, civil disobedience. When you disobey unjust laws, or when you demonstrate and protest when the laws are not being obeyed. And that was what quite a bit of these things were about. It was about, the federal laws that said we had the right to vote, and there were states where they literally killed us to keep from even registering, much less voting. And so there had to be demonstrations against that. So it was civil disobedience. But anyway, I'm going to talk about three civil disobedience icons we've lost in the last few days. Two men and one woman. And I wanted to do that because, number one, she rates being included. And I'll get to her in just a minute. But first, I want to talk about someone I actually knew pretty well. And this person, his name was Ct Vivian. The CT stood for Corby Tyndale. Most people don't know that. And he used to say, I just call me CT because the Corby Tyndale just didn't ring right. But he was a beautiful, beautiful human being. And I knew him from going way back into the late 60s. He lived in Chicago for a period of time, and I worked with him on some things. But yeah, Ct Vivian, I just want to share a little bit about him. He was a major force in the civil disobedience movement. He, of course, worked alongside Dr. King and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. In fact, he was one of the founders of it. And he was also one of the members of the Freedom Riders. And for those who don't know who the Freedom Riders were, although I'm pretty sure most of the people here who are watching or listening to this know, but just in case, they were activists who rode through southern states to make sure that bus terminals and other public facilities were not segregated. See, what happened was that they had been segregated for many years, and the federal laws made it illegal to segregate public facilities. And so the Freedom Riders literally took buses and rode through the South to make sure that they weren't segregated. Well, they were attacked viciously at various times and places all throughout the South. And one, I forget exactly where it happened, but I think it was Alabama. It was either Alabama or Mississippi, one, where the bus, one of the buses they were riding on was set on fire. And many times they got beaten. They were beaten by Klansmen and sometimes the police or police Klansmen or whatever. And so it was like, woo, it was not no joke. And then they were locked up too. But Ct Vivian first started out in Peoria, Illinois, where he took part in a lunch counter sit-in in Peoria, Illinois. And for those that don't know, Illinois, even though it's considered to be up north, we call it up south because there's some places in Illinois that are viciously racist. I mean, Chicago is too, but people don't realize that all throughout southern Illinois is like crazy. Now, he even got beat up on camera once. He was leading a march, or actually leading a group of people to register to vote in Selma, Alabama, same place where the march with John Lewis and them. But Selma, Alabama was vicious. But anyway, he was there with a group of people trying to register to vote. And the local sheriff there blocked the group from going in to register. And in fact, I'm going to show you in a clip in a minute, just a short piece from that. But the way that Ct Vivian responded, he told him, he said, we will register to vote because as citizens of the United States, we have the right to do it. And when he did that, when he said that, the sheriff responded by beating him until blood dripped off his chin in front of rolling cameras. And because of that, it helped galvanize support for registrations. And also, Ct Vivian created a college readiness program to help care for children who got kicked out of school for protesting racism. Now, this is very little known, but the Department of Education, the U.S. Department of Education, used his program as a guide to create a program that I participated in years later and didn't even know it. It's called Upward Bound. And right now, there's people, I know some of you all are watching this and saying, Upward Bound, I was a member of that. Yeah, Ct Vivian was actually the architect of Upward Bound. And it improved greatly the high school and college graduation rates for students in many communities across the country. And then in the late 70s, he founded an anti-racism organization that focused on monitoring the Ku Klux Klan. You know, that was dangerous. And he was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2013 by Barack Obama. So that's a little bit about Ct Vivian. Corby Tyndale Vivian. He passed at the age of 95. So I want you to check out this video, short video about him.
But we begin remembering the legendary human rights warrior, Reverend Ct Vivian. He died in Atlanta overnight at the age of 95. The Presidential Medal of Freedom recipient was once called the greatest preacher to ever live by the late Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He was a minister, an author, close friend, and lieutenant of Dr. King during the Civil Rights Movement. His daughter, Denise, releasing a statement on behalf of the family, saying in part, the family is heartbroken at the loss of our father, but proud of his lifelong work to free America from its tradition of racism, hate, and violence. He loved all mankind and will be missed. Let's take a look back now on Reverend Vivian's impact over the years.
We are all profoundly grateful to you and send you to Washington with the city's covering and God's blessing. We love you.
Equipped only with courage and an overwhelming commitment to social justice, the Reverend Ct Vivian was a stalwart activist on the march toward racial equality.
This courthouse does not belong to Sheriff Clark. This courthouse belongs to the people of Dallas County, and these are the people of Dallas County, and they have come to register.
Whether at a lunch counter, on a freedom ride, or behind the bars of a prison cell, he was unafraid to take bold action in the face of fierce resistance.
We have come to register to vote.
By pushing change through nonviolent demonstration and advocacy, Ct Vivian established and led numerous organizations to support underserved individuals and communities.
We had a method The method we had was nonviolent direct action. We wouldn't have had a movement if it hadn't been for two things: nonviolence, a method.
His legacy of combating injustice will shine as an example for generations to come.
Love will win.
Community leaders here in Atlanta and across the country are sharing their condolences. Dr. Bernice King tweeting several photos of Reverend Vivian, writing, you gave so much to make us better. I'm grateful and I will miss you. Senate candidate and pastor of the church where MLK preached, Reverend Raphael Warnock, sharing this statement, saying in part, the Reverend Ct Vivian was one of the finest human beings I have ever known. A gentle giant of a man, he stood on courthouse steps, literally staring down faces that were filled with hatred while affirming his humanity and theirs.
Yeah, wonderful human being. John Robert Lewis. John Robert Lewis, many people know of a little bit about him being beaten in 1965, and we're going to deal with that too, but I want to just share a few things about him that may not be known. He's another one who is what I call a civil disobedience icon. He was a Georgia congressman for, I think, 30 years. But he was just, John Lewis, and I got to know him a little bit when I lived in Atlanta. But he was first of all, let me explain. He was a very short in stature, but you when you meet him, after a minute or two, you realize that's a minor thing. He stood taller than his size. He was the longest serving member of the Black Caucus, Congressional Black Caucus. But he started out very young, very, very young. And I want you to understand this. He started out participating in lunch counter sit-ins, and he was also a freedom rider. And at the age of 23, he was a keynote speaker at the 1963 March on Washington. In fact, he was the last surviving keynote speaker. 23. And all they ever show you of the March on Washington speeches is Martin Luther King saying, I have a dream. But he was a part of that. And at age 25, that's when he helped lead the march for voting rights on the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, when they were beaten by heavily armed state and local police who attacked him with clubs and everything. That's when they fractured his skull. By the way, I fully support the movement that's building to change the name of the Edmund Pettus Bridge to the John Lewis Bridge in his honor, even though he is from Georgia and this is in Alabama. But Edmund Pettus, if you don't know, I know he was in the Confederate Army. I think he was a general or something. But he also was a major member of the Ku Klux Klan. So that's one of the reasons why that bridge is so significant in the history. And that event that occurred, it's been nicknamed Bloody Sunday. So if you hear the term Bloody Sunday, always know it's talking about 1965. Okay? And it so shocked the country that it galvanized support for the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which Lyndon Johnson signed into law. And, in 2011, that was 50 years or better after that. And that's when President Barack Obama went there and was part of that historic march to recognize that. And it's also he awarded John Lewis the Presidential Medal of Freedom in 2011. He was diagnosed in December of 2019 with pancreatic cancer, and that's ultimately what took his life. And he said it so deep, because this pancreatic cancer is no joke. Here's what he said: "I have been in some kind of fight for freedom, equality, basic human rights for nearly my entire life. I have never faced a fight quite like the one I have now." John Robert Lewis. And he walked with dignity all the way to the end. In fact, one of the last things he did was go stand, and he took a picture wearing his mask and standing on Black Lives Matter Plaza over near the White House. Because, he refused to go to the inauguration for the Tramp. So I just have to share that with you. But here's what I want to do. I want to share a short video of him talking about that walk. And then I'm going to go right into an actual film, short film, of that attack. Because you need to see it as it happened, and so you can witness how vicious this was. And remember, it was the police. This was the police. People tend to want to forget that, but I never forget it, because that's who was doing the beatings. Okay? And then I'm going to talk about a wonderful, wonderful black woman who also transitioned.
Well, I remember so well the afternoon of March 7, 1965. We left Brown Chapel Church. It was a silent walk, about 600 of us. No one saying a word. We were walking on the sidewalk. I was walking with Jose William from Dr. King's organization. We get to the edge of the bridge. Jose Williams said, "John, can you swim?" I said, "No." And I said, "Well, there's too much water there. We're not going to jump. We're going ahead." And we continued to walk. We came to the highest point on this bridge. Down below, we saw a sea of blue, Alabama State Troopers.
And at that point, were you afraid for your life, or was it just sort of something that said, keep going, this is about history?
We had to keep going. I thought we were going to be arrested and that we were going to go to jail, and I was prepared to go to jail.
Lewis's and the marchers' fate would be far worse than jail. The Alabama State Troopers unleashed a brutal attack. These images, broadcast around the world, awakened the nation's conscience.
Let's talk about the beating. You nearly lost your life on this bridge. Why do you think God spared your life? Why do you think you were left behind and we lost so many civil rights leaders?
I feel blessed that I didn't die on this bridge. I thought I was going to die. I thought I saw death. I said to myself, I'm going to die on this bridge.
But do you still think, why me? Why did I get a chance to live so long and, make it to Congress in Washington, D.C., and just make it to this whole level?
Yeah, I said to myself, and I often think about it, I think about the individuals that I worked with, marched with. I often think about Dr. King and Robert Kennedy and others that are going on, and said that I have an obligation to continue to do what I can to help, because I'm here to continue to tell the story.
Never facing your sheriff. Right to be in this court. Come on, let's go. We have a right to be in this court. This courtroom belongs to all the citizens of the county. We have a right to be here and will not in any way be interfering with the pursuit of traffic.
Be detrimental to your safety to continue this march, and I'm saying that this is an unlawful assembly. You are to disperse. You are ordered to disperse, go home, or go to your church. This march will not continue. Troopers here, advance toward the group. See that they disperse.
Now, I want to talk about an amazing woman by the name of Emma Sanders. But I'll give you a second just to let your blood pressure go back down after you got beat in the brain with that video. That's deep. All right, but here's the deal. Emma Sanders, I'm going to read this as we go along. Emma Sanders, one of the few surviving members of a group whose impassioned challenge to the all-white delegation at the 1964 Democratic National Convention brought an end to segregated delegations. She died on June 24th in Brandon, Mississippi. She was 91. Now, let me briefly, it's in the article. Mrs. Sanders, an educator who went on to pursue a business career and to be a voice in state politics, was a founding member of Mississippi's Freedom Democratic Party. Its slate, under the name Freedom Democrats, showed up in Atlantic City to challenge the state's all-white official delegation, which had been empowered by the regular party organization to help choose a presidential nominee. It was a foregone conclusion that President Lyndon Johnson was seeking a full term after the assassination of John F. Kennedy and that he would win the nomination. The convention was held in Atlantic City in August 1964, near the end of Freedom Summer. And I'm saying this, I'm reading all this because I want you to get in your head the picture of what time it was, what was going on in the world. Freedom Summer. A voting rights effort that had also swept up Mrs. Sanders, a great-granddaughter of a slave. She was one of the people who helped organize local citizens and some of the 700 or so young people from the North who flooded Mississippi to help black citizens surmount Jim Crow-era barriers that had kept their voters' registration at 7% of those eligible. Now remember, Freedom Summer was also the summer when some terrible things happened, but I'll let you do the research and find out about it, especially the 3 workers who were killed and some other things. But anyway, the Sanders family, like others, housed and fed the volunteers in their home in Jackson, Mississippi, as they went door to door to enlist potential voters or operating freedom schools for black children. You check that out. What were the freedom schools? Their efforts that summer were met with racist hostility, and 3 of the activists in Mississippi, James Chaney, who was black, and Andrew Goodman and Michael Schwerner, who were white, were murdered. In Atlantic City, Democratic leaders were embarrassed by televised hearings held by the party's Credentials Committee on the issue of segregated delegations and the subsequent standoff between the two from Mississippi. The party refused to seat the Freedom Democrats and unseat the official delegation. But weighing in on the matter, the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King supported a compromise that, although it left neither side happy, did move the practice of segregation at party conventions closer to the discard bin. And you have to understand that back then, the idea that black folks were challenging the Democratic Party. The Democratic Party at that time, up to that time, was very, very, very segregated. But you had both, the segregated Democratic Party and the segregated Republican Party. And here's a photograph of it, the delegates of the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party. And what you have to understand, too, is that people criticize a lot, they criticize black people in Mississippi a lot because of this flag issue, okay? And it's not fair, because I've heard some terrible things said about people, black folks in Mississippi, how they must be, stupid or something. But you need to really understand the history of what has happened in Mississippi and Alabama, and you would understand better why they were terrorized. It wasn't no joke. People got killed. They killed people in broad daylight in front of city halls and in front of places. And the people, well, don't forget Money, Mississippi. That's where Emmett Till was killed. So, and this is a true story, too, about what happened with the three the workers, Chaney and Schwerner and Andrew. Here's what happened. They disappeared, and mainly because it was 2 white boys, right? The FBI got involved. In fact, there was a famous movie called Mississippi Burning that really distorted that whole story. But here's the deal. The FBI started looking for them, and one of the things they did, they started dredging lakes and rivers in Mississippi, right? And they found bodies. Mostly black men, and it wasn't them. It wasn't them at all. So because they kept finding these bodies, the Ku Klux Klan said, "Look, we got to stop them from dredging these rivers and stuff, because they're gonna find these bodies. We've been killing these black people for years and dumping them in the rivers." So they had their informant. They knew who their FBI informant was in the Ku Klux Klan. So they told him to tell the FBI where the 3 workers were actually buried. They weren't in the lake at all, or rivers. And so they went there where they were told, and they found the bodies buried. And so they stopped dredging the rivers. But there were at least 2 black men who were identified that they dredged out of the river, who had disappeared, and their families did not know what had happened to them. But there were several more that they dredged up out of the rivers and lakes and stuff. So it wasn't no joke. It was not a joke. The Freedom Summer. Okay, so then after Freedom Summer, then the delegation, the Freedom Delegation, which was a legitimate delegation, went to the convention. They said, "Hey, we demand to be seated. That all white one, that one is not legit." And they were, it took Martin Luther King to come up with the compromise. So, anyway, it was a compromise and stuff, right? So now here's what happened. Most of the all-white delegation walked out, and the black delegates filled their vacated seats for a time, and then they ended up being removed. Well, the white guards tried to remove them, and that didn't work. So they officially later banned racial segregation in the delegate selection process. So by the time in 1968, the Freedom Democrats, reconstituted as the Loyal Democrats of Mississippi, were seated as the state's official convention delegation. Now, here's why it's important to understand this. That move, along with the federal civil rights legislation in 64 and in 65, caused a white backlash where many of the Democrats left the party. You just call them Dixiecrats. And they left the party and went over to the Republican Party. And that's when the Republican Party really went straight racist. And the Democratic Party became known as the party with too many black people. So they forever changed the Democratic Party. Okay? So, and it caused a lot of split even with the black activists and stuff. They didn't really, some of them didn't really understand it. And then some were saying, hey, we want black power. So, in fact, some of them said this struggle was not for civil rights, but for liberation. So now here's what happened. She stayed in the fight. She ran for Congress as an independent against John Bell Williams, a segregationist. She lost, but she said we ran strong, and that was a revelation. Because up until then, they weren't able to get any black candidates to be on the ticket because, remember I said it was 7% of the black folks in the state of Mississippi were registered, 7%. So they had to fight for this for a long time. Anyway, Emma Sanders stayed in the fight, and she was known, she and her husband, she got married to a brother, and they started a restaurant, and they were known for feeding folks, feeding the workers. So let me see, where is this? Her name was Emma Ruby Lee Dunbar. I love it. Emma Ruby Lee Dunbar. And she was born in Claiborne County on the Mississippi River near Vicksburg. Now, she graduated from Alcorn Agriculture and Mechanical College, now known as Alcorn State University in Mississippi. The country's first black land grant college. Look that up if you don't know what that means. And she also studied towards a master's degree in business at Indiana University. And then she became a school teacher and later served as the County Community Action Program's executive director. She did a lot of different work in terms of the people. She married William Sanders, and living in Jackson, Mississippi, they ran a restaurant as well as a business school together. And it was her son, Everett, who drew both his parents into activism in the early 60s. He had joined a campaign demanding that black folks be served in all-white restaurants and be allowed to worship in any church they choose. And so his parents jumped in with him and took the lead. I was like, wow. Which is, you have to understand, back then, that was actually pretty strong because many times the younger people would be working on working in terms of the different movements, right? The parents would always be, in fact, John Lewis talked about that. The parents would say, no, don't rock the boat. We don't want to cause no trouble, because they were used to the terrorism. But the younger people say, hey, bring it on. We're willing to go through this. And So for two parents to jump into the battle with their son, that was very unusual. It's very inspiring, as a matter of fact. So I salute them. And finally, just want to mention this last part. Her grandson said she didn't want her own children to become involved in something that she did not have a very strong understanding of. And her grandson, in 2004, became the first black executive director of the state's Democratic Party. So, so now, even though she had retired officially from politics, she kept campaigning among her family. At the 2016 Democratic National Convention, she told the Clarion Ledger of Jackson, she said, they know that when they get to 18, they have to register, and I want them to vote. She said, I check. I love it. I love it. Emma Sanders. Put her name down so you don't forget it. She's a civil disobedience icon, and I appreciate her. And we definitely should always honor our icons. Okay? With that, I close. I appreciate you. And I want you to, as always, no justice, no peace, no love. KNOW.